I'm Rob Francis. I'm the Planning and Zoning Director for the town of Norwich, and I've been here a little over a year. And in that time, we've been working on yet another version of the Norwich Town Plan. And one of the things that always comes up in this phase of redoing a town plan are controversies or concerns about changes to land use regulations and what they could possibly mean and how things work. This has heightened a little bit here recently because in roughly the same time frame as us redoing our town plan, the Regional Planning Commission, otherwise known as Taruba Regional Planning Commission, also redid their regional plan. And in Vermont, there's a sort of a mirroring of municipal plans and regional planning commission plans, particularly on the topic of land use. And so there's some confusion or uncertainty about exactly who has jurisdiction over what and why. And when that regional plan was going through the process of review, there were comments in Norwich and from other communities with regard to policies that the Regional Planning Commission was adopting with regard to lands in Norwich and other towns. So the Norwich Planning Commission thought that one of the better things to do here as kind of an introduction to discussions about land use with regard to the Norwich Town Plan was to actually have a discussion of zoning and how it works in very basic terms, and then leave plenty of time for people's questions. And then I would try and take a stab at answering them. There are some members of the Planning Commission here tonight, and there are also some members of the DRB here tonight. So we've got lots of wisdom and expertise to help everybody out. So we should be able to answer all the questions. Okay, so hopefully we'll have enough time to have discussion at the end, and I'll be able to collect any of your thoughts or concerns, and we'll feed that into the land use chapter revision process, which is currently underway. So I want you to think of the idea of real estate development as something akin to Rubik's Cube. It's very difficult to solve the puzzle. So you have to have, as you know, every face or every facet of the Rubik's Cube has to be the same color, and you spend endless amounts of time trying to figure that out. And if you get one side solved, or maybe even 3 or 4 sides solved, then you flip it around and you realize you haven't got the other side solved. And in the effort to solve one side, you often break another, right? So that last part is a really important metaphor for land development, that you might have 4 out of 5 things right, but in getting the 4th thing right, you just busted the 5th thing, and you need all of them, right? In this instance, you need at least 6. So the thing that's missing here actually is kind of a whole face that is just called good luck, right? In the business of development, I think they call that contingency, right? And they usually put a dollar value against contingency, which is basically code for things that will go wrong, but you don't know what will go wrong yet, okay? And in a large project, that can often run as high as 25%. So, you know, other facets, other aspects of our life, if you went to the store and they, you know, price of your groceries fluctuated 25% week to week, you'd be a little concerned. But in development, that's actually not that extraordinary. Okay, the town only gets 2 of these facets to deal with: regulation here and infrastructure over here. Most towns in Vermont, this one it's white for a particular reason. It's white because it's blank. For the most part, that answer is blank. We don't have it, okay? We have a road network, and we have police and fire. You can stretch your imagination and maybe think of those things as in infrastructure. But compared to even Hartford or Hanover, we don't have anything else. We just have roads. And that's kind of given away by us often referring to the Public Works Department as just the highway department, because that's the public face of Public Works. That's all they do. Norwich has got a fire district, which we can get onto later, which provides potable water to the fire district lands, which are roughly, roughly the same as the village district. But that's it. Many villages and towns in Vermont have just a highway department. no other infrastructure. So that's definitely a constraining factor in terms of what land can get developed and how it gets developed. What's the purpose of zoning, subdivision, and access permits? In other words, the land use regulations that we have available to us in Norwich. It encodes standards to protect the health and welfare of the community. That's chunked out of statute. That's that very nice sounding but somewhat empty statement from statute. Not entirely sure what it means to protect the health and welfare. And you'll notice that the theme here is dates right back to the very beginning of zoning, which was that without land use zoning, people were at physical risk. It's the triangle shirt fire. It's a whole bunch of examples like that where you would have incongruous and potentially dangerous combinations of land use. So the factory that was on the upper floors of a building in New York City that caught fire, and the women were trapped and died because they couldn't get out because there was no fire escape, is what actually triggered contemporary zoning in the United States. So the conclusion from that horrific event was that building owners shouldn't be able to combine incongruous or incompatible uses, factories on the 5th and 6th floor with retail on the 1st floor or some such thing, and that if they were going to combine uses, or even whatever uses they were going to have, they were going to have to ensure the safety and health of the inhabitants of the building at any one time. So a lot of the encoding around zoning is actually to do with these very basic measures. Is there clean air? Is there access to running water and sanitary facilities? Is there adequate access for fire safety and other public safety questions? These are all the kinds of things that have evolved over more than 100 years now that explains zoning. Of course, there's much more pernicious and weird stories, including using zoning to organize segregation by race and income type and a whole bunch of other things, but the origin of it was to overcome these really brutal incidents that put innocent people at risk for no cause of their own. So, in very simple terms, what we're trying to do is minimize the conflict, maximize the efficiency and the benefit, develop land in the most effective, what we like to call a rational planning process. So, like things go together, things that are definitely not the same, try and separate them, allow space between uses so that the negative consequences of one use can be mitigated, or just, the benefits of just separation can come into play. And again, done well, that's great. Done badly, you end up with things like very large scale retail places far, far, far away from where anybody lives or otherwise works or goes to school, and you have those kinds of issues. So originally, it's intended to minimize the conflicts and maximize the benefits. It's a question of how it's applied and how it's done. The important ingredient there is this notion called the character of the district. And one person's character is, of course, not another person's. It's a very subjective kind of thing in certain kind of ways. But remember again, this is land use and land use law, and there's hundreds of years now of accumulated case law and work about what actually does constitute the character. So it's the landscape, just the physical landscape, whether it's treed or whether it's open and barren, whether it's hilly or flat. So those are, to some extent, factors that are in play. But it's more usually to do with the built form. Here are a bunch of factories, possibly not the best place for a preschool. Here's a bunch of houses, possibly not the best place for a factory. It's that kind of simple weighing of what's consistent with the character. And then trying to contain the off-site impacts, trying to minimize the conflict between one use on one parcel and any use on a neighboring parcel. The process that we use breaks out into three simple categories that then get argued about endlessly. Prohibited, yes. Permitted, yes. You get a permit straight away. You don't even have to go to the DOB. conditional. You're off to the DRB. There's factors there that need to be considered for your project. That's layered. We can get into that a little bit later. And then there's just the ultimate one, which is no. It's not on the list. It's not a use we're allowing for. You can't do it. When we say we can't do it, what we're saying is, given the current rules, there are mechanisms where you can actually have the rules rewritten and changed for a specific use, but that is a pretty gargantuan task in the context of most development in Norwich. So, this is a screenshot from the famous Norwich zoning regulations. This is the purpose statement, which describes the character of the commercial and industrial district. We'll get on to exactly where that is. It might be, it's kind of a fairly well-kept secret in Norwich as to where the commercial and industrial district is, partly because, you know, there isn't really anything happening that's industrial. So, but you get the general flavor of the statement, right? There's some interesting things in here that are important for us to look at and think about with reference to the town plan and other things. You'll notice that it actually speaks of allowing residential use in the commercial industrial district. You might think immediately that's kind of a conflict. In some ways it is, but it speaks to the more contemporary notion of what we call mixed use, where you can imagine large-scale housing developments, say a 3-story or 4-story block of apartments that contain maybe more than 25 apartments, being of such a scale that it would be incongruous in the village and not likely to happen in the rural residential district, but perfectly appropriate in the commercial industrial district given its access to transit and proximity to jobs and a whole bunch of other things that might make it fairly appropriate for that location, given it some other factors that are a little more nuanced, including landscaping and design and a whole bunch of other things. But really it's pointing to the scale of the project. And in contemporary land use, particularly in Vermont, the notion that you could have a large residential development in a commercial industrial district is not totally uncommon or unheard of, at least from a permitting standpoint. Whether it actually happens too much in practice, that's sort of a different question. And you'll notice that what they're describing here is things that would make a difference if you're trying to actually run a business, particularly a business that relied on
Here is some information for will make difference. According to idioms,
ready access to employees being able to access work easily, and then deliveries, both pick up and you know, picking up finished goods, dropping off materials for sale or whatever. So the idea that it be close to a largish highway, paved highway, with access in this instance to I-91 is an important feature. So it's that, getting back to that rational planning notion. So just before we move on here, you'll actually see in the format of this page, it's set up in 2 columns. There's a list of permitted uses, and then there's a list of conditional uses. The conditional use is a special kind of review. A permitted use is, you kind of hit the bullseye. That's exactly what we think should happen in that zoning district. So you can have a permit pretty much just by applying to the zoning administrator. All right? There are some things technical things that might need to be adhered to. Some other permits might need to be at least, shown to the zoning administrator, such as an access permit or something from the state if there's something present there, or a life safety permit. But basically, you're going to apply for a permit for a permitted use, and you're going to get one. There's no necessary reason why you're off to the DOB for that. A conditional use, then the DOB, which remember is appointed by the select board, is meant to be representative of the people of the community and meant to represent the interests and standards of the community, are going to review the application against the regulations and potentially make what we would call conditions on the permit. Require the applicant to attend to particular things or do things in a certain way. Sometimes that can be quite specific. In some communities that can get down to which kinds of plants you can plant, where you will plant those plants, that you will actually put money in escrow against the idea that these plants will die next winter, because they always do, that they'll be replaced in the spring, that they'll be replaced at least twice until they stay alive, that the wattage of the bulbs inside the lit signs don't exceed a certain value, that the signs can't be seen from a certain distance from the establishment, that the colors of the walls inside and out will meet certain tonal requirements and of intensity, that if it's an alcohol establishment, you won't be able to read an advertising sign for an alcoholic beverage from a certain distance. You can go on and on and on. We don't have much of that stuff, right? But that's generally the kind of conditioning that a development review board can apply, as long as they've got the rules to support it, that would then refine the application and make it meet certain character standards for the district. Typically, outside of large metropolitan areas with large resources, there's very little character regulation for residential development. There are large parts of the United States where there might be a minimum area size for a house rather than a maximum. They might have a minimum. Sometimes it's 3,000 to 4,000 square feet. Sometimes it's in combination with some other factors. There's certainly ways in which the appearance, the palette of colors that you could use to paint the house, or the bricks you could use, or whatever, can be dictated through the zoning. For the most part, particularly in northern New England and New England more generally, there isn't very much of that in residential development. And particularly in the south and the southwest, much of that actually comes not from zoning requirements, but from homeowner associations, which are often present and sort of synonymous with the boundaries of a subdivision. So they're really commonplace, and sometimes people here are confused about the experience that they've had somewhere else at the hands of a homeowners association, and then what's going to happen here under zoning. And for better or for worse, we're pretty permissive about residential development. I generally don't have a view on what you're going to do if it's residential. Just, you should do it. Okay, so the idea of the conditional use review that I just mentioned, and the examples that I gave, including up to and including, can you see the sign from a certain distance? What is the content of the sign? That's actually illegal now, but for different reasons. But a whole bunch of those kinds of things. How big are the lights in the parking lot? Does the light make its way off the property and then disturb a neighbor? These are all questions that are answered through conditional use review, and those are all things that we do have standards about and can be implemented. And so what we're really trying to do there is make sure that any of the negative impacts of that kind of development stay on the parcel that the development's projected to happen on, not leak out and impact the quality of life of abutters. Dimensional standards are a tool that we have for minimizing any of these off-site impacts, and they're built in. They're built into the standard zoning requirements, so that if you were to create a parcel or to build a structure in a zoning district, then you know from the beginning what the dimensional standards are. And in Norwich, they're pretty straightforward. So by dimensional standards, we simply mean how high can the building be, how close can you have it to the property boundaries, how close can you have it to the front of the lot relative to the road, how close can it be to the back fence. And they're pretty minimal standards in Norwich. They're all pretty short distances, actually. Shorter in the village for obvious reasons than they are in rural residential, but we're talking, 20 feet setbacks for front setback, and 8 and 10 feet for side and rear. So not really big. So 8 feet's not much. I'm 6 feet. So when I stretch my arms out, I'm 8 feet. That means that you can build a house anywhere in Norwich, and you can squeeze me between the property line and the wall. That's pretty short, actually. Okay. Obviously, most people don't go that close for obvious reasons, but it is actually pretty tight. The other things that we have include buffers. We have buffers for various natural features for the most part. We have buffers for ridge lines, preventing people from developing on ridge lines so that that view, that quality of Norwich that we all share, walking and riding and driving around, which is the undeveloped ridge lines, mountaintop, hilltops, stay that way. And so you can't, even if you own the land, you can't build inside the demarcated ridge lines, and therefore impact the view shed of your neighbors and friends. We buffer wetlands by 50 feet. When we say wetlands, we mean mapped wetlands by the state agency responsible for that, Department of Environmental Conservation. And we buffer streams, mapped streams, which are 50 feet. If you're lucky enough to have frontage on the Connecticut River, it's 75. So then we use these other development standards around parking, signs, and landscaping to ensure that we're adhering to the character. And we normally break out parking standards and so forth as a ratio of parking spaces to the number of apartments or some measure such as that, or in retail and commercial and industrial for square feet of development. So, and those numbers are relatively modest. They could probably be tighter. So one of the things that's happened over time in the last 10 to 15 years is that we've squeezed down the amount of space that we're willing to give over to parking, because we recognize that we shouldn't encourage it, and it's not always necessary. And so we're trying to reduce the amount of land that is developed as parking lots. So this really straightforward flow chart shows you actually how to go about getting a permit. So the top blue shaded area is the local, and the bottom one, which is a little bit in the tan, is the state. This looks, the one for the state looks really straightforward, doesn't it? Except for this is really, would be better described as a black box, this process here. You may get in there, but you notice that there's no way out, right? That's actually intentional. Once you've got an Act 250 permit, you've always got an Act 250 permit. And what goes on in this black box more or less stays in the black box. It's really hard to figure out what goes on in there. Once you're in, you're never out. So for us, the process is a little winding, and I'll get to that in a minute. The distinction between an Act 250 permit and a local permit is really important. Just because you're a big project, either 10 acres or more of disturbed area, or 10 dwelling units or more, means that you instantly qualify for an Act 250 permit. Or if you're unlucky enough to inherit some land that already has an Act 250 permit, no matter what size it is, you've still got an Act 250 permit that you have to deal with. The distinction here is, one of the important points here is that just because you need an Act 250 permit doesn't mean that you don't need one of these. In fact, what you need is both. If you've got a larger project, you need one of these and one of these. If you want to change something, you're going to have to amend this one, and maybe you're going to have to amend that one. So it's a factor that's somewhat unique to Vermont, the sort of doubling up here. There's some interesting historical explanations for it. We can get into that later on. But for the most part, what I want to alert people to is that depending on the size of the project, as to whether you're going to need both or not, and then this one, there's no getting out of it once you're in. So back to us. The first thing you do is you apply to me, the zoning administrator. You come in, or you download very slowly because it's Norwich, an application permit from the website. So you go make a cup of coffee, and it's just opening up when you get back, maybe. And then it's not a scannable PDF because it's still 1986 in my office. And then you print it off, and then you fill it out, and then you could scan it, and then you can send it back to me, and then I can look at it. Or you can just bring it in, or you can come in and talk about it. What I do is review whether it's going to be permitted, in which case, you're straight to here, right? So that's actually pretty quick. There's a check involved, which I didn't mention, but that's fairly obvious. But you could go straight through to here pretty quickly. So for most people in Norwich, actually, that's their experience. They want to come and build a deck. they want to build a shed, they want to build a garage, they want to build a sunroom, that's all that happens. There is no issues. There's no issues with setbacks, there's no issue with the conflict with the neighbors, there's just no issues. It's just pay your money for your permit and go to Home Depot. In fact, many people actually come get the permit on the way to Home Depot. It's fairly straightforward, which most people from big cities find really difficult to believe, but yeah, you can do it that way. If, on the other hand, it needs a conditional use permit, or you're asking for anything else, including a special flood hazard area, which is lands that are demarcated by a map that are prone, that we have established are prone to flooding, and therefore must be reviewed in a particular way to a particular standard. Then you're off to the DRB. And then all of a sudden this stretches out. It's a bit unrealistic, this dotted line here. It should be, I ran out of space, it should be all the way over here, because straight away there's a 15-day warning period, and then there's the preparation for the DRB hearing. So if you submit something to me before the DRB within 3 weeks, then you've really hit the jackpot. It's more likely to be closer to like 5 or 7 weeks before you're at the DRB. And then they review it. Then they have 45 days to write a decision. Then they do that. Then it turns into a permit. Then you're off. Okay? Hopefully you don't get appealed. But you never know. And then the one thing I'd say about it back over here is that if it's a new development, so if you've just bought a piece of land and there's nothing else on it, including a driveway, then the other things that you're going to need from the town of Norwich is a highway access permit. And that's a written permit. It involves meeting with the Director of Public Works on site and making sure that where you think the driveway should go is a safe location for the driveway, so that the sight lines are appropriate, that they meet engineering standards, and there's a huge manual to help guide the Public Works Director in terms of establishing what a safe access point is. And the other concern that he would have, Larry would have, is the possibility that if your driveway slopes down towards the road, that ice and snow is going to come off the road, off your driveway, and go into the road and cause a hazard. And so that's the kind of thing that he might stipulate, that in fact there needs to be, your driveway needs to actually be graded away from the road just very slightly, so that anything that's coming down your driveway actually doesn't make it onto the road, and thus cause a hazard. So there's those kinds of things. That's the kind of thing that I would check for. If you need an access permit, you actually get it from me as a start, but you end up going through a little loop with Public Works. Way over here, there's this long list of potential specific permits that you may need from various state agencies, depending on the nature of the development. None of these really relate too much. Well, I take that back. Some of them relate to bigger than your normal residential development. Some of them are pretty basic. So the first one is wastewater, the euphemism for a septic permit. So if it's a new development, you're going to need a septic permit, and you get it from the state. You don't get it from us. You may need a stormwater permit. Depending on the parcel, you may have wetlands, and you'll need a delineation of those wetlands and a wetlands permit to demonstrate that you're either A, not interfering with the wetlands, or that B, in agreement with the stream engineer from the state, that you're interfering with it in an appropriate way. So you can bridge wetlands, you can step, there's ways you can move over wetlands, but you need a permit from the state. The RC refers to river corridor. If it's a large project, that comes into play, and you need a river corridor permit for as part of your Active 50 permitting process. So this flowchart is just intended to give you an idea of how you get from concept, I'd like a new deck, to permit, or something a little bit more complicated if it's going to go through conditional review. Where do municipalities in Vermont get the power to regulate land use from? Two sections of statute, 24 VSA 4411 and 4418. So if you want to Google that, you're more than welcome to do that. It basically lays out the ability of a municipality to adopt land use regulations such as Norwich has. and to implement them in a particular way. Some of it's procedural, some of it's also sort of the scope, if you like, of the regulations that you can implement. Regional planning commissions, on the other hand, are enacted through statute, and section 4345A describes their role vis-a-vis municipalities. All they can do is provide legal assistance to municipalities in the preparation of bylaws and plans and capacity studies and so forth, and then support municipalities in the implementation of those things. So what's really clear here, and what I want to make really clear, is that the Regional Planning Commission, in this case, Turu Zetakichi, doesn't get to dictate local development outcomes. It can't intervene or intercede in a local zoning permit process. They can't review my work. They can't stop me from issuing a permit. They can't come before the DRB and attempt to stop the DRB from issuing a decision or issuing a permit. They don't have that authority. There's been some confusion in the recent past about exactly how much scope a regional planning commission has to actually dictate the land use outcomes in a particular municipality. Regional planning commissions are enabled and to develop their own set of criteria and policies governing land use in their regional area. And Turu Zetakichi has definitely done that. And in any Active 50 proceeding, regional planning commissions have automatic standing.
I just want to ask, so the Regional Planning Commission does get to review and approve a town plan.
Yep.
But on the other hand, the zoning and subdivision regulations, they don't have a role in approving them or not?
No.
Okay.
No. That's a good point of clarification. So the process for adopting zoning and subdivision regulations, as long as it meets the statutory requirement, and that's a significant test, it ends with the select board. So if the select board adopts and does the adoption process properly and the regulations meet statute, then that's the end of it. The Regional Planning Commission may or may not like them, or may not think they're the best idea, or may have concerns with some aspects of them, and they're more than welcome to articulate that, but they don't have any influence over the outcome. Right? They're not voting on it, they're not approving it, they're not disapproving it, they're just along for the ride and able to provide technical assistance, which is, comment on whether they think it's a good idea or not. The one, yeah, okay, follow.
Well, and do they typically seek to see them as they're being developed? Do they try to have input?
Yeah, I would say this Regional Planning Commission does. I'm not sure, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as try to have input, but they follow along very closely, and they're always available for support and input, is what I'd say.
What's the impact if they don't approve the town plan? Because you said they approve the town plan, like, that implies that they have some sort of authority.
For a town, so yeah, this is,
Yeah.
let me, so when we're writing the town plan and we send it to the select board, the terminology that we use to describe what they do with it, if they like it and they vote for it, they will end up adopting a town plan.
Mm-hmm.
There's a simultaneous or a sort of, it's kind of either be simultaneous or subsequent process that involves the Regional Planning Commission. So we would send our town plan to the Regional Planning Commission for their approval. What that enables us to access is various state-based planning grants and other forms of support. We don't have to get Regional Planning Commission approval for a town plan. We typically do, and I, as a professional, would always recommend that a town in Vermont always should strive to get approval, because then you are given access to this funding sources to actually, implement your
So
planning
there's
program.
some pressure to make them happy about the town plan.
That's sort of a little bit like, that's not a bad summary.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit, there's obviously more wrinkles in it than that. It's a little bit more complicated. We can talk about that a little bit later if you want. But in general, what I'd say is the purpose of the approval and the reason, the way they can get to give you approval is that your plan, your local plan, meets the guidance and the policies of their regional plan. So if there's a mismatch between your local plan and their regional plan, like an open contradiction, we think this should be yellow and you think this should be blue, then there's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
But where you can come together and go, okay, how about green? Then that's actually a pretty good outcome. And so sometimes there's a little bit of back and forth, but in general, so it's not, for me, it's not just that a town then gets to access state funding to implement the planning program. It's that there is also another layer of review that's established that the town's plan is broadly consistent with regional land use policies, which are themselves also consistent with state land use policies. So there's this sort of notion that you're all heading roughly in the same direction, yeah, rather than in conflict with each other.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of you, but our town went through a plan last year, and then it was rejected by somebody. Apparently, it wasn't the.
It was
the original planning commission.
Oh.
You not so much. We can talk about it later. What I'd say about that is, and I was there for it. It was an odd event. I'm not entirely been at this for a while. I'm not entirely sure that's happened. It certainly hasn't happened to me before, and I kind of hope it doesn't happen again. I'm not entirely sure, really, to this day, exactly how to explain why it happened the way it happened. Nevertheless, it happened. It's democracy at work. So there were ways in which the membership of the Regional Planning Commission interpreted the staff report from staff of the Regional Planning Commission in such a way as to justify voting down approval of Norwich's town plan. I might add and really insist that you remember that the staff of the Regional Planning Commission were recommending approval, but for whatever reason the meeting decided not to approve it. They also didn't approve some other town's plan that night too. I don't know if the coffee might have been off. So anyway, that explains why we're doing the town plan again, and this time we hope to get it approved by the Regional Planning Commission. So this last point's really important, that and I said it right back in the beginning, if it's a larger scale project, you've got to get all the necessary permits. So that could include an Active 50 permit and a local zoning permit. And the process for an Active 50 permit can be both time consuming and expensive. So as a rough guide for a different community, but still in Vermont, that built a 50 unit affordable housing project with no local zoning issues at all. There were no questions about the impact or the design or anything. It was all green lights at the local level. And there was very little for the state to be involved in, and in fact other state agencies were supportive of the project. Nevertheless, the Active 50 permitting process cost them $50,000 and took 6 months. So, and that's, it's a project that the state wanted, it's a project that the town wanted, it's a project that other parts of the state government wanted. There was no pushback, there were no problems. It didn't meet any roadblocks or obstacles. Just the level of technical process that was involved, in particular the development of plans and their review, cost, for Active 50 purposes, cost $50,000. Now, it was, a $20 million project, so, it doesn't, so to put it in perspective, it wasn't the single biggest expense that they had by any means, but it was not an inconsequential expense. Okay, back to Norwich really quickly. We've got zoning regulations that were last amended in 2009, so quite a while ago, with regard to our awareness of such things as climate change or whatever. But on the other hand, by many town standards, fairly recent. It's not unheard of to encounter regulations that were written in the 1980s still, pretty frequently. We've got 5 zoning districts, really only 4. As far as I can tell, there's like 1 or 2 tiny differences between Village Residential 1 and Village Residential 2. Like, you have to be a real pro to pick up the difference. And I don't always get that right. And then there's Rural Residential and Commercial and Industrial, which are 2 separate districts. We've got I would describe them as novel subdivision regulations. We have subdivision regulations that have, some people refer to it as a black box process, where depending on where the parcel is in town as to how many parcels you can subdivide that larger parcel into. In other words, and then therefore determine how many houses could be built on it. The further away you are from Tracy Hall and the smaller the road, the less adequate the road, then the less density you can have. The closer you are to Tracy Hall and the better the road, in inverted commas. So if you're on a paved road and you're within 1.5 miles of Tracy Hall, you can have a much higher density of development than if you're way at the end of Turnpike or Tiger Town on a dirt road that, you know, is more than 5 miles from downtown. That is pretty novel in Vermont. We can talk about what that looks like over there. I've got a map for you to look at in terms of every E911 address that's been issued since 2010 and where it is in Norwich, so you can get a sense of how that plays out. What I'd say is that while it is theoretically encourages greater density closer to the village, which is a good thing from most planning perspectives, the market reality is that most people, when they're doing subdivisions, are developing at rates way under the maximum density. So, you know, you could have a parcel that you could subdivide into, say, you could have a 40-acre parcel that you could subdivide into 22-acre parcels and therefore have 20 homes. But what you actually see happening in reality, what the market ends up doing is it subdivides that 40-acre parcel into two 20-acre parcels and you get 2 houses. That's a big difference. 2 to 20 is a really big difference. And so we're operating at that level, a really low level, and not a really high level. I'm not sure what it would take to actually have people start maximizing the density allowance and really develop much more intensively. It speaks to a whole lot of things that we can talk about a little bit later, but that's the way it's intended to work, and I'm not sure it's giving us exactly the outcome that we thought we were going to get. So the last one is the commercial and industrial district is east of Route 5 South. Any normal commercial or industrial use that you can imagine in that district requires a conditional use permit. So in other words, almost anything that happens in the Route 5 South commercial and industrial district is going to have the full DRB review. So it's not like if you wanted to open a repair shop next to the co-op repair shop, that you're just going to get a permit from me. Even though your neighbor is doing exactly what you would like to do, you're going to need to come before the DRB and be subjected to the entire review process to make sure that what you're proposing to do meets our standards. That is probably a little problematic in some ways, but it doesn't, in practice, doesn't present itself very often because there's just not any activity. Linda?
I hope this isn't too detailed, but what's the language that requires that? Because you showed us before that there were permitted uses.
Yep.
But so, and there's some there, and so.
Accessory structure, agriculture, bed and breakfast. Yeah, all things that don't happen there and you wouldn't expect to happen there. I've got the binder here.
But, okay, so if something is one of the permitted uses of pure and simple, it's a bed and breakfast, would they have to get a conditional use permit or no?
No.
Okay.
Here's what's permitted that you can't see. Daycare, group home, home daycare, home business, home industry, multi-unit dwelling, but see subsection E2, which means not really. And then conditional uses, an accessory structure, which is really stretching it. Accessory dwelling structure, which is now actually illegal under state statute. A bank, a contractor's yard. Remember, so this is what you might expect in a commercial and industrial district is a contractor's yard. And so you might think that you can easily get a permit for a contractor's yard if you wanted to put it in the commercial industrial district. But oh no, you're before the DOB explaining that what you'd like to do is have a commercial use in the commercial district and go through elaborate processes of review to establish that. The community centre, a cultural facility, a funeral home, an inn, light industry, nursing home, office, parking facility, public facility, private club, recreational facility, research and development facility, restaurant, retail, mixed use. So almost everything, up to and including the names that you use to describe the district, require conditional use. You'd be better off calling this the conditional use district.
Ah.
Right. So, and you know, I want to point out that in other jurisdictions where I've worked, if you wanted to put a factory in an industrial district, it's pretty much like, yep, you know, send the check, you know, send the check, send the drawings, make sure that, you know, you've got your life safety permit. That's it. So, you know, when somebody's trying to make a decision as to whether to locate in New Hampshire or Vermont, and you can say yes rather than, ooh, that'll be 7 weeks, and I'm not sure. It doesn't take that much imagination to figure out what the response is going to be. Because you've always got more than one option if you're going to do something like that, right? So, either we mean to have a commercial and industrial district, I guess is what I'm saying, or we don't, right? There's a way of reading this which makes you feel like people are very, very concerned about absolutely anything happening here. And maybe that's legitimate, maybe that's not legitimate. And I guess I'm suggesting that this is definitely a public conversation that needs to be had. Okay. Oops. That's the end already. Okay. So here's the zoning map. Now, obviously, there's chunks of Norwich that are missing here. And also, Norwich doesn't look like this at all. So, there's just two small problems. First of all, I tipped the far northwestern corner down so that it would fit on a nice square piece of paper, right? So really, it's like this, right? In fact, you'll see here that this is Main Street. This really runs north-south, so it's off a long way, okay? But the good news is that when I do this, it fits on the screen because I don't have the other option. And then the other thing that's happening is everything out here, where Roger lives, and there's the whole rest of Norwich, the wilds of Norwich, that are being cut off. That's because there's absolutely no difference between what's up here and what's here. It's all rural residential. 97% of the land area of Norwich is rural residential. It's astounding. I've never encountered another community where more than 90% of the total land area is just one zoning district.
And you say it's 97%?
97, right? So all this shaded area, and then down here on Route 5 South, that's less than 3% of the total land area of the town. So to get back to that rational planning and what we think we're doing and what are we doing, question the sort of things that establish a zoning in the first place, this is an interesting outcome of that process, right? And maybe we would do better to think about more categories or slightly different boundaries or something. It's just, and I'm not saying that 97% is wrong, it's just really unusual. And so it's worth thinking about how we got that way and what do we mean. It's more customary in Vermont that you have this band of what we call rural residential, and then further out you might have rural, where the minimum parcel size is much bigger than 2 acres. So the minimum parcel size in rural residential is just 2 acres. That means the entire rest of town can all be 2 acre lots, which is, depending on your point of view, pretty small. And certainly if everyone had a 2 acre lot and a house and a swimming pool and a garage, then not a lot of agriculture is going to go on, so it's not going to be really very rural. And even if you did break up all of the rural residential area into 2 acre lots, it's not going to be very rural. So the emphasis is on the residential more than the rural. We've got that funny subdivision process of minimizing how many parcels you can get out of a bigger parcel due to density, but
If the first parcel is rural residential, can it be broken up into more 2 acre or more lots without any kind of notice?
No.
No, okay, so
No.
there's a process.
So, to subdivide land or to merge land in Vermont requires 2 parallel processes that must be adhered to entirely. So the first process is you need to add things to the land records, to the deed,
Yeah.
the title. And you can't really do anything there without having a companion permit issued by the DOB. So for it to have meaning and to be applicable, you have to have pieces of paper in 2 places, right? And so, yeah, you can't just subdivide amongst your family and friends and go, that was great. No. Yeah, for all sorts of good reasons, you know, about the law and surveying and a whole bunch of stuff. So, okay, so this is a zero, you know, this is a close-up, obviously, of where we are right now. VB is village business, the mauve area, right here in the middle. And then this shaded area here, this is Route 5 south, and this is I-91. And so it comes off just a bit south of 10A and sort of fans out. So this is the car store, which is now the Co-op's service center. And on through, this is King Arthur Flower. And this is the Hartford Norwich town line. This is, I guess this is Fox, Columbia, right? Yes, Linda.
And can you define, like, what does Village Residential 1 mean and Village Residential 2? And then also, like...
I knew you'd ask that, and I just didn't want you to do that.
Oh,
There's practically...
We could put
Okay,
that
go on. Yeah, go on.
oh, well, and then I'm also curious, for example, if you look at Village Business,
Yep.
what if, so I'm looking at, I think it's, you know, on the right-hand side, it's essentially showing Carpenter Street, right? That kind of Y street.
This here,
Yeah, look at the bigger part, it'll be easier to see.
Thank you, Lynn.
But so the top part of it, like, what if
So, yeah,
there's something
this is Carpenter
adjacent?
Street.
Yes, so what if that next parcel just north of, what if somebody wanted to do a business there? Could they not do it?
Right now, the answer is no.
Wow,
Yeah, wow.
okay.
Right, and so this is what happens, right? Somebody at some point draws a line on a map, and then after that, that's it. And so, you know, you might say, what's the difference between the business that's going on in here and here? Or even, what about the person on this side running a home business, which is permitted, but it's a bookstore, an antique bookstore, and this person can't run an accountant's office or something such as that, right? What is the impact relative? Is this not anything nearly as bad as that? Do accountants
And
type
isn't-
really loudly? What's the
May
problem?
I ask a
Yes.
specific question? Isn't farther along Main Street, isn't there a B&B?
Oh, yeah.
And is that not a business?
No, that's, well, yes, it is. You'd hope it is. But that's okay. That's a permitted use in the village.
In residential?
Yeah. People are mostly sleeping, you know, it's not that impactful really. Unless you burn the toast all the time. Don't ask me why I know that. Right, so yeah, I mean, it's, right, these are all good questions. And then it's also a question of scale. So you can have a bed and breakfast, 1 to 3 guest bedrooms, pretty much anywhere. You go 4 to 6, and then you're off to getting a conditional use permit. Why? Because the parking and the noise from 4 to 6 guests is really different from 1 to 3. That's it.
What about Airbnb?
Well, you raise a really good point. And what I'd say about that is that we have very few Airbnbs, and we don't have anything specific in our regulations to govern the operation of Airbnbs. We
Right,
don't
because they
require.
weren't around in 2000.
That's right. We don't require them to get a bed and breakfast permit. And we don't have any real easy way of regulating them. It came up in a different meeting today about Woodstock, where it's now evolved to the point where people are specifically buying homes to turn into Airbnb businesses, and they'll own multiple homes in Woodstock and just operate them as Airbnbs. which is impacting people's
Housing.
access to housing in
Yeah.
Woodstock, right? Just regular housing. So Norwich is surprisingly low-key in the Airbnb market. I've looked, because that's the sort of thing zoning administrators do. I've looked repeatedly on Airbnb for places in Norwich. It's not huge. It's not nearly as big as I thought it would be, given where it is, given its location, right? I don't know exactly what the explanation for that is, but I would not, at this, I can't put a number on it, but I don't think we've got a Woodstock problem by any means. It's not impacting people's ability to access homes for all year round living rooms and such as that.
And may I just ask for a village business, is there a list of the types of businesses that can go there? Like, not industrial seeming, but are they all retail? Is that basically?
Pretty much, yeah. Permitted uses in village business are accessory structures, banks with an asterisk. We'll get to that later. Group homes again, because the state
What's a
requires it.
group home?
Home daycare, because the state requires it again. Home business, home industry, which is a little odd, office. 1 or 2 unit dwelling, a restaurant, that sees subsection E, retail, asterisk again. All the asterisks require site plan review. So that's looking at lighting, parking, those kinds of impacts, making sure that your business activity is not going to impact a neighbor. So for instance, the parking lot behind the post office, there's a residential neighborhood, Jones Court or whatever it is, over the fence basically. And you can imagine pretty easily that if that was to stay really brightly lit all night or something, that it could really disturb the residential neighborhood immediately behind it. So those kinds of things come up. And the conditional uses would include light industry, the kind of things that you would expect. Yeah. So, yeah. All right. So, I want to just touch on what happens if there is a conflict between Norwich land use regulations and Two Rivers land area policies. And then, so the outcome there would be, if the project requires Act 50 permits, then the Two Rivers policies will be considered by the District Commission, which is the reviewing body that issues Act 50 permits. And case law supports the notion that Two Rivers policies take precedence over local land use regulations. So if there's a conflict, it's most likely to be resolved in favour of the Regional Planning Commission, not the town. So that's another reason why you're probably better off trying to resolve these conflicts before rather than after, because it just is much more difficult. So I want to get to the last part here that the town has responsibility for, infrastructure. Norwich does roads, Class 2 and Class 3. Class 4 we do bridges and culverts only. We don't do the actual road. Class 4 roads you'll know because they're actually really small and limited access, usually in fairly poor shape. Potable water, we have the fire district. Under state statute, a fire district in Vermont has similar powers to a municipality. This fire district supplies potable water to the village district. And then wastewater, it's all handled on site. And since 2007, it's the state that issues wastewater permits, not the town. I think what I want to emphasize here is that if you acknowledge that the town has these two things, that it's two sides of the Rubik's Cube that it can have anything to do with, regulation and infrastructure. In some ways, because of Norwich's resources, this limits the ability of the town of Norwich to really do much with large-scale outcomes. And so one way of thinking about this is that we don't really have regulations that are going to permit a whole bunch of things that the community has expressed dissatisfaction or displeasure with. And we don't really have the preconditions for really rapid growth or development, mostly because of this first point, that we've got very challenging geology, mostly around the question of wastewater. And the way the state permitting process is set up, the limited range of systems that they would approve and permit, means that it's very difficult to envisage a scenario where you're having something different from a single family home, or maybe a duplex, and a septic system that's designed and installed for that property. I mean, you know, you can get a septic system for a 5 or 6 bedroom house. They're very big and they're very expensive and they're kind of difficult to look at. But you can get them, right? But it's a huge step even from that to saying, what would it take to get a septic system for 5 2-bedroom units, or something such as that, or a large retail development. If somebody was proposing a retail development, the single biggest challenge for them would actually be getting a wastewater permit, probably, right? Not the kinds of things that we would impose. So I think that first point's really important. The other aspect of so-called community scale, so self-contained wastewater systems. So imagine that you've got an intentional community. A group of people come together and they want to build an ecologically sensitive community. They want to have 10 homes that are all arranged like a 2 sets of 5 townhouses together, right? Right? Clustered together, and then you all want to share a septic system. Both to satisfy the bank's needs and the state's needs, you're going to have a pretty complicated document and something akin to a homeowners association to address the installation, ownership, and ongoing management and testing of this septic system. And so assuming that it's technically feasible and it can be designed and built, then you've all got this share. You know, you've got however many, 10 households or whatever, 20 households, sharing the legal and technical responsibility of maintaining the septic system. Some people find it pretty challenging to maintain their own without actually having to check in with 9 other people on how that's going. So a lot of people find that extra layer of responsibility and cost really off-putting and will avoid it. And so it takes very passionate people with lots of resources and lots of determination to overcome those kinds of impediments. Other states, particularly New Hampshire and New York, are much more permissive about different kinds of wastewater treatment systems, and you can choose from, if you like, far more models. So they're not as expensive, they solve problems in different ways, they can be larger and so forth. Vermont has a very traditional unlimited set of designs that they will permit. So that's part of the problem.
Is there a reason for that Vermont does that?
They like the ones that they like, and it's difficult to persuade them, and they're not retired yet.
Is there a particular, is that influenced by a state agency that feels like, yeah, this is the right way to do it? And
Yes,
that
the
other-
state agency that does the permitting, the Department of Environmental Conservation, has a wastewater division. They have a set of policies and a set of rules, and they're pretty narrow, and they're not, I would say, it's not my field. Talking to Jeff Goodrich or somebody like that who actually works in a couple of different states would be really useful. But my sense is that in other areas, other states, other jurisdictions, there's more flexibility. So it's one of those factors that, oddly enough, the town's not responsible for, but it's still an infrastructure factor. And so it's one of those things that if you're trying to think about why does Norwich have the kind of development that it does, and why does it happen where it happens, then this is part of the explanation. So the predominance of largish single-family homes with their own well and their own septic system is to some extent a reaction to the geology and the regulatory framework, but that one is provided by the state. So you need about 1.5 to 2 acres to actually manage the separation distance from a well and the septic system. So that's, quite a bit of land for some people and not very much for others. Yes?
Do you know how, if, let's just say, and hypothetically, we were gonna maximize the number of single-family homes in Norwich, just as a thought experiment?
Maximize the number of single families, yeah.
That's right.
Yep.
On, what I'm understanding is you could take all of the existing privately owned land and subject to ridge lines and vernal pools and that kind of thing, subdivide it all into 2-acre lots minimum.
Yeah, very hypothetically, yeah.
Very hypothetically.
Right.
How many of those lots do we realistically think would be, you could create?
Oh, a tiny fraction of that. So what you're talking about is the so-called theoretical yield. I tell you that you've got 100 acres and the minimum parcel size is 2 acres. You instantly think, oh, I can have 50 parcels. And then I show you a whole bunch of maps and start telling you all these other things, and then you start thinking about, well, the road is going to take up some space, and then there's this, and then there's that. And then all of a sudden, you don't have. The theoretical yield of 50 is just implausible, and you might, in the Norwich instance, you might get 15.
But we don't know actually.
You can never, it's really, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to tell that until you do the work. I mean, there's some cost and complexity involved in actually doing that.
I mean, from a conservation standpoint, if you have a lot of climate migration, that would be an interesting thing to know. I would think, in terms of thinking about future zoning and whether you want to create a more compact zoning around the village and less dense zoning outside of that, and sort of think
Right.
about.
So I think what I hear you saying is, if you're going to plan for growth, which is an important thing to do, first of all, you have to agree that you want growth, and then you should plan for it. Then where are you going to put this growth is the next logical question. And so yes. And it wouldn't just be necessarily questions driven by ecology. It might be things such as, the distance to the school or access to transit or a whole bunch of other things which could have positive climate change attributes, but not be directly related to that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that would be an important thing.
But absent doing any of that planning, you're sort of defaulting, it seems to me, to your theoretical yield.
Yeah, I mean, all I'd say is that there's a lot of time when, at this point in the process, all you're really working with is a very rough theoretical yield and the knowledge that 50 units, 50 parcels is plausible under the rules,
Right.
but the reality is a tiny fraction. There are definitely studies that get done to actually figure out what the more accurate number than the theoretical yield is. There's a lot of variables though, and there's other things that you need to know in terms of what kind of community were you aiming for, or what kind of community were you going to accommodate in a way, right?
Right.
So, and things like land values and a whole bunch of other things that also play into it. So there's a notion of a buildable lot, for instance, so that 1.5 to 2 acres that I just talked about, how much do you need? And in some communities in Vermont, you can see a wild fluctuation in the size of the parcel, but not much fluctuation in the price. And basically what you're looking at there is some kind of rough sense of what a buildable lot would cost. So you can have a 5-acre lot with no view and a steep driveway, but okay for septic, and that could be $70,000. And then you can have a 2-acre lot with a stunning view and a ridiculous driveway, but okay for septic, and that would be $70,000, right? So the only real difference is, the view. So there's those kind of attributes that you get into, which, are a bit beyond the zoning question, but definitely play out in terms of the interaction between the market and the regulations.
I have a somewhat
Sorry.
slightly peripheral, sorry.
Yep.
Go ahead.
You had mentioned that you look at ridge lines and try not to build on that, and riparian corridors and wetlands and stuff. Is there anyone yet in Vermont that you know of looking at wildlife corridors that are being designated by the Department of Nature?
The state is.
As a non-build, yeah.
Right. So the latest approach that the state's taking, and so also is the Regional Planning Commission, is the designation of forest blocks. That map over there is an effort at representing them. So the green, the kind of orange, and then the red are each of them high value, medium value, and low value forest blocks.
Right.
And that represents also about 85 to 90% of the total land area of Norwich.
Yeah.
And which means that the kind of conclusion that you reach from looking at that is that you would discourage development in the
Right.
shaded areas and try and encourage it in the non-shaded areas. It doesn't leave you very much.
Yeah.
So that's a big question. And we also already know from looking at this map over here that there's already a lot of people living
Yeah.
in the shaded areas. So something's going on
I just
there.
wonder like how landowners react to that when there's talk. Like,
Some of them love it. Some of them are really into it. Some of
Yeah.
them are like chafing. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not consistent.
Yeah.
But what I'd say about the wildlife blocks is that it goes, the notion of defining a forest block is, part of that is determining and defining the behavior of wildlife
Right.
and their paths,
Yeah.
and trying to protect their paths and not have them interrupted by human
Sure.
settlement.
Our pattern of development, though, in the last, 10 years at least, is all focused in those areas. That's the only place anything's being built right now.
In the forest walk.
Yeah. It's a little,
It's a nice place to live.
yeah, right. It's a little bit like that, the thing that we're becoming more familiar with now, which is the notion that national parks and various, public assets like that are being loved to death.
Right.
And so there's a way in which people with means choose to buy a forested lot in Norwich, which requires, maybe a four-wheel drive to access it, and maybe a generator to ensure that you've got constant power, and a bunch of compromises. What many people would regard as real challenges in terms of comfortable living, but they're willing to do that because they're in the middle of the woods, right? And so they've got this, in their minds, a wilderness experience as part of their residential life. There's ecological arguments against that. But there's definitely a market
I'm just
behavior.
wondering if it's ever being incorporated into zoning yet, or,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. So you may want to, so that's a conflict, but we don't really have a mechanism in our rules to prevent that conflict from happening.
I want to respect people's time, but I
Yes.
just wondered, just to sum up, if there are key takeaways, or maybe we won't answer them all tonight, but other questions that is there anything you didn't hear about tonight that you would hope to hear about? Maybe Linda, anything you didn't hear about tonight that you would hope to
Well,
hear?
the only question I have is, once the new town plan is written, I know there's significant changes in there. Won't that also, you will redevelop zoning
Yeah,
regulations
exactly.
and possibly bylaw changes, so what we're being told today may change. Because if we get the mixed use and.
Right. What you're being told today is what's on the ground today and
Today.
what's in the rule book today.
Mhm.
The discussion that has to happen as part of the land use chapter writing process is to try and get a better sense of where the community is at vis-a-vis development, and then what the pressures are and how, looking ahead, the planning commission feels the town should develop. And then outline in that chapter the scope for subsequent revisions to the regulations, which would happen after the town plan has been adopted. Linda?
To follow up on Linda's point, so the reason though to change or to end up amending zoning and subdivision regulations would be to make them reflect what the town plan says. Is that a good way of thinking of it? Right, is it right now, are they,
What
are
I'd say
they in
is,
the town plan kind of matched
yeah,
up?
the purpose of the town plan is to raise the issues and to discuss them to some extent, but most importantly, flag them. When we go into a formal revision of the land use regulations, then the whole public discussion basically starts over. And hypothetically, and I'm really hoping that this remains hypothetical, the direction that the community could take could be, completely a 45-degree turn from where the town plan is going. We'll just go, no, we think this now, right? And as long as the process is appropriate and legitimate, and the planning commission goes along, then yeah, you could end up, in some ways, contradicting, if you like, the direction that the town plan lays out. The ideal is that the town plan lays the direction, and then the public process involved in building the new land use regulations is respectful of that direction and reinforces that direction. But there's nothing stopping you from throwing a U-turn. People do it.
Susan, anything that you didn't hear tonight that you'd hope to hear?
So everything is going to be decided in town meeting, basically.
Oh,
Because some of these
no.
things are going to be warned. The other question I have is, what if some people decide to petition what the regional planning commission has approved that has not been approved by the municipality and puts it on the town warning? I mean,
Okay, there's a couple of things loaded into it. First of all, the town plan gets adopted by the select board. It doesn't go to town meeting. So the adoption, which is a form of approval, a formal process of approval of the town plan, is something that ends at the select board. It doesn't have to go to town meeting to be voted on. The same with amendments to the land use regulations. The zoning and subdivision regulations can be amended, and those amendments can be adopted by the select board, and they don't have to reference town meeting. So, under statute. So, that's an important clarification. Then the second one that you had about residents wanting to petition to have changes to the regional plan.
To adopt what the regional planning commission has approved, if it differs from what the municipality has approved thus far.
There are ways in which you can have a difference between the regional planning commission plan and the municipal plan, and there's mechanisms for either adjudicating on those differences, in other words, acknowledging that there's these contradictions, and there's mechanisms for reconciling those differences. So the method for acknowledging that there's these contradictions or conflicts and that that's the way it is, what I'd say there is that back here, when there's a conflict between the local land use regulations and the regional planning commission's policies and criteria for development, and it's an Act 250 proceeding, then the regional planning commission policies will prevail.
But that's Act 250.
They don't have any direct say in the application of our local rules under the threshold of Act 250. So we can have a conflict, and the conflict just sits there. They might prefer us to say something very particular in our land use regulations, and we don't. But it doesn't. That conflict never comes to a head because they play up this Act 250 level, and most of the permits we issue don't involve Act 250. So it's like they never crash into each other. They're acknowledged, and we see them, but they don't stop anything from happening. Right? It's not a direct head-on collision. It's just oh yes, we're different. Now, to get our town plan approved by the Regional Planning Commission, obviously we have to pay attention to those conflicts. And there has been, I'm sure you've noticed recently, there's been some conversations about the new policies that the Regional Planning Commission plan, the draft plan, has included with regard to interchange areas for towns in the Regional Planning Commission area. And some towns feel as if that is going to influence the outcome more than they would like. But I don't see the process problem exactly the same way as some of those communities, and I think it's more a question, again, the conflict is if it's an Act 250 permit. Absent the need for an Act 250 permit, that contradiction can just sit there.
Liz, anything we didn't talk about we should have? Okay. Roger, anything else you wanted to hear? Okay.
Linda?
I have one follow-up.
Sure.
Tell me if I'm wrong on this. Just when we went through the last town plan, I thought the town could petition that the voters get to vote on the plan, and the voters get to vote on the zoning regulations, but the town would have to petition it. So it could be the select board or the town could get a petition out so that they get a vote on it.
There is a mechanism whereby you can, voters can end up forcing the town plan to a vote or the zoning and subdivision regulations to a vote. I need to check that. I think there is a mechanism for that, but it requires a pretty substantial petition and,
Okay.
what I'd say there is that hopefully before it got to that the planning commission in Norwich and the select board would work to address whatever the concerns of that, those people that wanted to petition, at least enough to the point where that didn't happen, but I think, technically you might be right.
Okay.
It's certainly not common or customary. It's generally, that's a pretty heated arc, that's more heat than light kind of arc.
Okay, thank you.
And any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Feel free to email me or phone or something if something comes to mind after tonight and then you want to follow up on. Thanks very much.